Hello, and welcome to Legal Candy, where we are unwrapping the sweet secrets of law. So today we have a very emotional episode talking about something that has happened very near to our office, and we have once again, Darby M is here, our esteemed legal student who's coming to us with some of her insights that she's learning while she's in law school, which is probably a revolution of all the new things that you're learning to empower you through the practice of law and life. And so we have her here today, and today's episode is we are going to be talking about Maya Kowalski and her case against Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital that ultimately led to allegations of something called medical kidnapping, which was, in my opinion, it was the first time I had ever heard.
I felt like it was invented.
Yeah,
I think it was invented just a few years ago for the purposes of cases like this.
Yes, because that's sometimes what happens is something takes place and you'll be like, the system may go, this is not right, but I'm not sure which cause of action it falls under, right? Because some people will ask me, just being a lawyer, they'll say, this happened to me, it's got to be illegal. And then I'll hear the facts and I'm like, unfortunately, that doesn't fall under any actual cause of action, right? We have to have a named cause of action to arrest somebody under. We have to have a named cause of action to sue someone under. So common things are like, obviously, battery or theft or breach of contract. Those are called causes of action that people don't kind of understand that terminology. And so it's got to fall under one of those. So this was the first time, so absolutely, we're seeing the concept of something called medical kidnapping. And I don't know if we have, as a parent, you have these nightmares that always go in your head once you have children. And I think this was one of those things that was a nightmare that no parent ever thought could happen.
Oh, for sure.
Because you're taking your child to a hospital. You would never think that it could end with your child be taken away from you and you being able to not see your child through their medical stay. Mm-hmm. I don't think people ever thought that could ever happen.
No, you look at hospitals as these sacred entities where you can be protected and not all of a sudden have the rug pulled from under you and all of a sudden you're losing your kids one day.
Absolutely.
Like you went there to protect them and now all of a sudden you don't even have custody towards them or a right to protect them.
Yes, and I can tell you that if you're listening to this in anywhere other than probably Clearwater, St. Petersburg, Florida, this story was so massive in this area because it took place really close that it really resulted in a lot of parents being very scared and have been second guessing them wanting to take their children to the hospital. I mean, that is a true thing from parents that I know. From mothers I know, mothers that work in my office are afraid because these are the kind of things that once it starts to spread, you're like, oh my gosh, if this happened to her, could it happen to us? So today's episode, we are going to get into the facts of what happened in that tragic case, what took place to where it ended up where a lawsuit ends up getting filed on behalf of this family against the hospital, and they just returned a jury verdict, I think we got just a couple of months ago, that resulted in $250 million that the hospital is liable for. A lot of money liable to the family. So we're going to go over what those facts are. I want to start by reminding everybody that just as our legal disclaimer is that before we delve into today's legal confections, a quick reminder that the information provided is for informational purposes only, should not be construed as legal advice. It is not intended to substitute for or replace professional legal advice. If you have any questions, please seek a qualified attorney, which I am, but it all depends on if I'm qualified in your area. So reach out to us if you have any questions or another attorney. I also really want to always start by preferencing that when we talk about things, especially on this show right now, is we're going to be talking about these are specific instances that have taken place against the Child Protective Services. They were also named in the lawsuit and against the hospitals, and they have a defense also of what they believe that they were following the guidelines. I understand the difficulty that Child Protective Services have in a general sense in handling cases when they're involved with children. It is a sensitive subject, and I understand that a lot of people are trying to do the best they can, especially doctors in a hospital, and I hate that such negative press has been out against the hospitals and the Child Protective Services. But what I hope and what I think I've gathered from listening to this story, watching obviously the Take Care of Maya special on Netflix, is that one of the things about this, about us talking about it, is that we would hope everybody learns from this situation and that we become better as a society. Our Child Protective Services, their entire kind of way of handling a case, we hope they've learned from it. We hope the hospital has learned from it, because nobody should think that this one incident means every time you deal with Child Protective Services, they're going to be biased. Or every time you take your child to a hospital, you're going to potentially end up losing your child. So we don't want people to think that way. But we just hope that this kind of wakes up everybody to kind of the mistakes that were made in the process. So let's really delve into the backstory of what took place with Maya Kowalski. So at the time, around 2016, she was a 10-year-old girl that was facing and dealing with a rare pain disorder called Complex Regional Pain Syndrome, CRPS. And I remember, Darby, you have more of that medical background. I don't try to say that I'm dual and everything, but that you have that medical background. And so what this diagnosis ended up seeming like to me, which I think is one of the triggers in this case, is that it is extremely rare. It's hard to test. So it usually comes with, every time I hear something like that with a disorder or disease, it usually comes with this overarching allegations of, is it real?
Yeah,
right?
is it attention seeking?
Yes.
Is the child needing more attention that they're not getting from home? Like, it's when you have a stomach ache because you don't want to go to class that day, so all of a sudden you're sick, but you're not really sick. And it really kind of triggered like an autoimmune disease. Like, those things go unnoticed for years, and people have all these symptoms, and then doctors can't treat it. It really reminded me of that. But the really interesting thing about the CRPS was that it's been known for 100 years, but it hasn't actually been relevant in medical teachings till the 90s. So I think that's why it went really confused upon doctors.
Unnoticed.
Yeah,
unnoticed and undiagnosed.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what I was kind of seeing from this CRPS, this Complex Regional Pain Syndrome, is that they're saying that it is extremely rare in children and that it's one of the most painful diagnosis that can happen, syndromes that can happen, where you're having unexplained pain in different areas, and it's like usually supposed to be a burning sensation that's happening. It's hard to test. So there's a lot of allegations of, is this person making this up for attention? And what that also comes with is specialists. That's the thing about medicine that nobody thinks about, is that medicine is a science, which means it is not exact, which means when you go see a doctor and you give him your allegations of what your symptoms are, he can give you a diagnosis, and that's why people say, get more than one. Because you can go to another doctor who's going to give you his diagnosis, and what is it usually based on? Their experience. How often have they experienced something? So if you're going to a hospital that's seeing generalized everything, opposed to when you go to specialists, they're going to sometimes come to two different diagnoses and thoughts of what your treatment is and what your care is and what's happening to you.
I mean, it gets even more complex than that. Is a specialist an MD or a DO? I mean, it's their background on traditional medicine or holistic medicine. Like, it just keeps going. So it's really where your values lie, and I do believe that you should get more than one opinion and make a well-rounded decision on what to do with your child or your own personal health.
Okay. So Maya Kowalski, a 10-year-old girl, adorable, little blonde-haired little thing. Her mother, who becomes kind of she's the mother of all mothers at this point. I mean, I don't think anyone can listen to this story and not honestly, as a mother, as a parent, just relate to the struggle and the fear of what she must have been going through. But the most interesting thing about Beata, her name was Beata Kowalski. Her father was Jack Kowalski, and she has a brother, Kyle Kowalski. Is that Beata was a nurse herself. So put those things together. A mama bear who also is a nurse, and she was Polish. I think that plays a huge role in the fact of her first language is not English. So she now has taken a role as a mother would in her daughter's treatment. So they figure out that she's got this CRPS, which is really through kind of them seeing a specialist. So Dr. Anthony Kirkpatrick, he ends up being kind of a huge specialist in this case, where he is the one who gives her the diagnosis of this CRPS. And his opinions about the treatment of it, and this is huge to me, is that he believes that one of the ways of treatment, there's a couple of different things, and one of the most invasive ways of the treatment is literally, that's not being done here in the States, is a procedure in Mexico where they're using ketamine. So I guess they are using ketamine in the States, but the high doses of ketamine that he believes she needed was so high that she needed to be put into a coma. And so they send her to Mexico. She does that whole thing. They think it's just doing so much better. She's getting better, all of this stuff. So they use ketamine, which ketamine is a known street drug. So it is being used on the streets, being abused on the streets, but it can be helpful in some of these instances with some of these type of pain if it's being dosed right. So after she goes and gets this intense treatment, then she starts to do better, and then she kind of relapses again, and the family is like, okay, she's having all these things. She's having headaches, blurred visions, skin lesions, her lower legs, and you guys can see this video online. There's so much video of you seeing this little girl. They did a really good job documenting this. Here's what I can tell you, side note is, what I have learned about what I do, every single thing I do, and I tell my staff all the time, everything in my normal life, document it. Take your phone out, grab your notes. When I'm on the phone with Verizon, I'm documenting the call we had, who I talked to, all of that stuff, because you never know when something may turn into a bigger instance. In this instance, some of the best evidence at this trial was literally the recorded conversations that the mom had, the videos that she had of her daughter showing that she had these illnesses. So you can see this just chronic pain in this little girl. She's unable to put any weight on her feet, and her feet are actually kind of like they're bowing inwards, as you can see in a couple of the videos. And so the pain starts to get worse. So she takes her child, as any mother would at this point, to the hospital. Takes her to Johns Hopkins Hospital. So imagine all the pieces I just told you about her as a mother. If you've ever had to deal with someone else's illness or yourself, one of the biggest things that we learn and we've been talking about is advocacy. So I think abnormal. I think from a system, we're always looking at things to fit a mold, and that's what happens with Child Protective Services. They're like, here's the mold of what we think abuse looks like. This is what we think that Munchausen syndrome looks like. And then they think if something falls into that category, here's what it is, but they have to take into account the external facts, the external things that make it abnormal. And I think the things regarding the background of Beata the mother and what they'd already been through and how much she already knew, which is why she went into that hospital that night and said, listen, my daughter's here, here's what she needs. And their response to it was, whoa, we got to get Child Protective Services involved. We think this woman's out of her mind. She's overdosing her child on ketamine. And so that's what starts an investigation that leads to this concept of medical kidnapping. So we're going to go to our first break here, and then we'll see you right after the break. Talk more about it. Now we're to the fact that we're talking about what ended up happening when Maya's, who's 10 years old at this time, now she starts having these pain, and she takes her to the hospital. So obviously we imagine all those things about Beata, her mother. When she goes in there, I can only imagine what she's saying. And I have been in this situation to a minor degree before when my son was little, and he kept on having this reoccurring cough that just kept on coming back over and over again. And everybody I took him to just said he had pneumonia, walking pneumonia. They kept on giving him antibiotics, and I was so against antibiotics at the time. I'd read all this stuff, and I was like, I did all this research, and then I found out that based from my research on the internet, that it looked like he had viral infused asthma. So I talked to my uncle, who's a doctor. He says that's probably what it is. So when I took him to the next specialist, I felt like I'm like, hey, I hate to come in here with my WebMD that I found, but here's what I think it is. And what I do know about doctors, lawyers, nurses, unfortunately, is there is an element a lot of times of ego, right? We have a way we want things done. As a lawyer, when someone tells me that they have a brother, cousin, dad who's a lawyer, and then they want me to talk to them, and then they're giving me an opinion, and they're not in this area of law, or a person who watched a lot of Law and Order, I have to be real careful about me not inserting my ego, and then really trying to educate the other person and explain to them why that's not the way to go. And I know you saw that on Law and Order, but we can't just all of a sudden surprise everybody and go, ha ha, and I can't just start screaming at the top of my lungs during the trial. Those things will get me thrown in jail. That's what happens. But a lot of times as a doctor who's in a hurry, right? They are always in a hurry. They're going from one room to another. They have 2 seconds to talk to you and you. I think that gets lost. Their bedside manners can sometimes get lost to where they're like, we want to do what we believe is the right thing to do. We need you to get out of our way. That's where I think it probably all started. She's telling them, no, this is her diagnosis. I need you to give her this much ketamine. I know exactly what I have no doubts what it looked like. And when we watch some of the trial back, that's exactly what's happening. She's going in there very, very, everybody really kind of, even her own husband says, she was very matter of fact. She was very kind of forceful about the information. Assertive is a good way to say it. Assertive is a good way to say it. And not sugarcoating it. And I happen to say, a lot of the people who are from those Polish, all that kind of stuff, they don't sugarcoat anything. They're going to tell you exactly like it is. I have an amazing accountant who I love so much, and I was just telling her this, and I was saying that's exactly what it is that a lot of times it's when you're ethnic and from somewhere else, you don't really you come across as very direct, and that's exactly what she did. So all those things put together, her now not taking no for an answer from the hospital, and the hospital's going, we come to find out they don't really know about the CRPS because, as you were just saying, it's not very heavily researched. It's definitely probably when you're going into, we found out it's very rare in children. So the odds of the hospital being apprised of that and that being their first go-to, they wanted to do what a hospital more than likely should be doing there, which is doing a full investigation and not just going, you just brought your child in here. We're not going to pump her up on it pretty much at this point in time, in their opinion, an illegal amount of ketamine. They felt like they needed to do the right thing by doing a full investigation while the mom's panicking going, this is what I know she needs and she needs it right now and you need to give it to her. And so that is when it sparks the investigation. So we've got mandatory reporters in so many different places, in schools, in hospitals, which means their responsibility is to report any type of potential child abuse. And what has also developed, just I would say it's more of a recent development, is that we've had normal types of child development, which would normally be, the physical, emotional abuse, those kind of things. But we see this new concept of this medical abuse. That comes from the concept of looking at a lot of the Munchausen syndrome by proxy. That syndrome is a psychological disorder where a caregiver, typically a parent, exaggerates, fabricates, or induces the physical or psychological health problems in somebody else, often a child. And a lot of times they're accusing them of doing this to gain sympathy, attention, fulfillment of the caregiver's need for a sense of importance. They'll do things like GoFundMes that are not really true. So those kind of things. So all those things together has now made it to where the Child Protective Services in most states are really kind of looking at that type of abuse too. And that is what they accuse this mother of Beata very early on when she first gets there because of her, because they said her aggressiveness towards the treatment is what made them very uncomfortable, and her not really calming down because she felt like she knew her daughter needed it. Her daughter's in pain, and she believed that was the only way to make her feel better, while the hospital's going, there's no way we're giving her this amount of stuff. You need to calm down. And then they do their first report. So the report starts to be initiated, and they start to do an investigation. And it all happens really quick, like over like a 3-day period that they're looking into this to try to figure out, do they have enough to do something called an emergency removal of the child? A protective order is technically what it is by the Child Protective Services. And so that's what they start looking into very quickly. And the minute that they start looking into it, ended up resulting in I think there was 2 reports that happened right back to back. And they start being investigated by a Dr. Sally Smith. She's a child abuse pediatrician who becomes very pivotal in this entire situation. And I, as an attorney, were very shocked to learn some of those details of who she really was. And so they get her involved, and she is very well known in investigating these instances. the very important concept that we learn about this woman, about Miss Smith, is that she actually is not working for the hospital, yet walking around sometimes in her white, coat. She starts interviewing parents, asking them questions, and they all think that she's a doctor, that they're protected under doctor-client privilege and all that stuff. And come to find out, she is a doctor, but she doesn't work for the hospital. She's working for a subsidiary, Suncoast, of the Child Protective Services. So Child Protective Services has now outsourced, it's been privatized, so it's been outsourced, and she's working for them. So she's already, if she's involved, she already technically is working on behalf of the state to figure out, does she have enough to move forward to take your child, while you really don't even know what she's investigating.
You don't even know who she is.
Yeah.
When she walks into a room.
You really don't know who she is. And so they start to do the investigation, and this is where I think the biggest no-no really kind of shows itself with the investigation part, and that's the problem that I have, is that during the investigation, they're saying that her behavior, the mom's behavior, is very indicative of potential this Munchausen syndrome, that they don't believe that she potentially has this, and the mom's over medicating her. That's really what the investigation is. And they believe that they need to do something quickly, or this child may they're thinking that if they send her home, that this mom may find another way, because doctor shopping is another thing that they are very concerned about, that they're afraid if they send her home, that she may end up dead, the child. So that's a hard place to be in. As Child Protective Services, as a doctor, I don't necessarily disagree with the original question of the investigation of getting involved, because I can imagine how it kind of looked to an outside perspective to maybe start an investigation of how this mom was, because she's coming in demanding an insane amount of ketamine in a disorder they're not really sure of, and in a treatment they've never heard of that she had done in Mexico. So I just think all those things together could have sparked the investigation. Now, if the investigation and the obligation of the state of Florida, which is to be unbiased, that is really the problem that I have seen the most. I've represented parents whose child have been taken under protective custody of the state when I first started my career. I've done a bunch of different areas of law, and that was one of them. And here's what I've always said to these parents. Once Child Protective Service gets involved through any kind of complaint, happens a lot with divorces, whether legitimate or not, they have an obligation to investigate with divorces. If you happen to get a DUI and your child's in the back seat. If I've had a client who one time she had lost her job, worst place in her life. She was drinking heavily during the day and went to the bus stop to pick up her daughter, and she was wasted at the bus stop. So they called. Those are all mandatory reporters. So that opens up an investigation. I always tell my clients, there is nothing fair about it. That's what I can tell you. If you knew what the standard was, which is just probable cause, right? We've talked about that's a low standard to start the investigation in order for them to believe and to potentially take your child as an emergency protection. That is a very low standard, and it's very discretionary. It's very discretionary. So that being said is that the obligation on the state is that you must stay unbiased the entire time, because you are representing the state, all the people, not just this child, representing us all. You should be fair to the child, but you should also be fair to the parents. And that's where it gets blinded. Same with state attorneys, is sometimes that line gets very blinded with what they personally feel is happening. And they forget what the facts are. And what they'll do is they'll pick and choose which facts they want to consider for their report and diagnostic, or deciding if they're going to charge someone, or decide if they're going to take a child. They start picking which facts they want that really fit the narrative that they're hoping for,
the side
that they believe, right? That's what I think happened here. I believe Dr. Smith, she believed in her 30 years of experience, and I guess her reputation ends up being that she's very aggressive about it, and I'm sure she has saved countless children's lives, right? This isn't one of them, but I'm sure she has over her experience. But what I think where she failed to do her obligation was that during her investigation, the very first thing that that kind of becomes huge is that we've got the mother who's saying, I didn't diagnose her by myself. We had a doctor, Dr. Kirkpatrick. He's the one who diagnosed her. He's the one who gave us the regimen, and he's the one who has helped prescribe this level of treatment. So Miss Smith, Dr. Smith, does what she should be doing, which is investigating this doctor. I mean, and she talks to the doctor, and he gets on the phone, and he says to her, we see this through the trial, and we also see it through the documentaries, he very much clearly says, it's absolutely true. Those are all things that I've stood behind, and I have said all of that stuff. Somehow that gets kept out of her report that she sends in. She leaves out the report that another doctor is the person who has literally diagnosed her and started this entire treatment that now has become an issue. Are we over diagnosing? Are we over treating this child? If the burden was that you've been convicted of child abuse, okay, that's easy, right? There's a conviction, but these are not those things. We're not talking about the high level. We're talking about sometimes lower things. Does it look like something? Could it be something? And that's enough for them to say, we are taking your child into emergency shelter, which means the state of Florida is taking them into their custody. You can now, you get one chance at a kind of a first step of a hearing. There's a hearing that happens within 24 hours. Not enough time for you to get an attorney, all your evidence together, none of that stuff. So usually it stands, you don't even understand the process. And what they said that happened here, which was horrible, is that as soon as the mother starts realizing that what's happening is they're not giving my daughter the treatment she needs, and I know she needs that, and she's going to get sicker, is that she tries to actually she goes, well, I want to have her discharged from this hospital. Yeah. It makes sense. She doesn't want her there. That just now ramps up the investigation more because they're like, oh, now she's trying to run. And so based on that, they quickly move for the emergency shelter, and they get a judge who signs off and says, okay, there's enough here for us to literally take custody of this child. So as I guess, I think when I was reading some of the information, to me that was kind of very, very upsetting was that the way that they told the family was they come in and the mother has just left, and the father, Jack, is literally cleaning up feces off of the floor because his daughter now cannot hold her bowel movements. So he's cleaning up feces, and that's when they come in and said, hey, by the way, I know you didn't know this was happening. That's the other thing. They don't have to tell you. You will all of a sudden find out when they come with the police department to take your child. It is the most traumatizing thing that when it comes to a legal system that a mother can go through, a father can go through, a families can go through. That is so traumatizing. They come and they literally rip your child from your arms wherever you're at, and they're like, surprise, you may not even know there's an investigation, but we have enough to just take you. You have no rights at that point in time. They take your child into custody, and then you have 24 hours for your first hearing, and then that one usually just confirms what already happened, and then you have to wait for your actual full hearing. And so they come in and say, thanks for cleaning up after your child. I know this is traumatizing for you, but we're going to make it even worse. We are now taking custody of your child. You cannot see her, neither can her mother. And that starts the just most painful experience for the entire family, as one can imagine. So as it kind of unravels is that it becomes this fight. So they get an attorney, and now everybody's arguing over her treatment. But at the same time, the mother is losing all hope because she keeps on trying to get in touch with her daughter. They finally allow the phone calls, so she's able to talk to her child. The advocate that they give her child, her name is, Kathy Betty. So Kathy Betty ends up being the actual advocate social worker who is now in the hospital. And I had never seen this before, so it's interesting as this is. Custody is usually given to an individual, either a foster parent individually or another family member. That's another option sometimes, a family member. The custody was actually given to the hospital. So your 10-year-old daughter, now she's in the custody of this hospital with no family there. The fear of this 10-year-old, I couldn't even fathom.
The confusion.
Yeah.
Like, she's 10. She just knows she can't, the psychological toll that must take on her, growing brain and personality at that time to not understand why her parents aren't there. I'm so surprised Maya came out of this very with her head on her shoulders and didn't blame her parents for this, because like I wouldn't understand at 10 years old why my parents weren't there.
And I guess she said that when she testified that she had asked so many questions and no one was giving her any information. The times when she was allowed to speak to her family, they were not allowed to discuss the case. So at this point in time, I couldn't imagine the abandonment she felt. And she wrote letters about how lonely she was and how much she wanted her family back. But it really, those had no bearing. None of this had any bearing until the unfortunate end of what takes place, that when they finally decide to give her back to her father. So it's about, there's a hearing that takes place about at 87 days after she's been in the custody, and the only thing that's been allowed is she has been allowed to talk to her mother, and her father has now been able to see her. Her father was able to see her, and her brother was able to see her, but her mother was not allowed to have any physical contact or unsupervised phone calls with her daughter. The rage that just kind of went through my body every time I heard the story, and then now really delving into it for us to talk about it, it literally, I'm hot right now. Like, I'm so hot because I'm thinking, I know you guys know my mom, okay? And so my mom is on the cray-cray spectrum sometimes when it comes to her children. So I don't know what I could imagine besides if I was laying in a hospital and the moment someone says your mom can't see you, I probably could have I would have been like, so here's what I'm going to tell you. You guys should probably rethink it because, give her about 12 hours in this place. She'll turn this place upside down. That's what ended up happening, I can promise you. So will the rest of my family. So that to me was, just unfathomable for a parent. But the rage I was feeling for her during that time as I'm listening to her recorded calls and what she's saying is really, really difficult to even imagine as a parent at the same time as you're trying to realize that you feel like your child is potentially dying in the hospital. So we're going to go to a commercial break. We'll come back and talk about what happens at the end of this story. This unfortunate, tragic story has an unfortunate ending. And around about 87 days of no contact, somewhere around there's another hearing before the judge. And I want to kind of state to what some of the quotes are that I saw from the hospital is the facts in the law. The hospital has stated that the facts in the law remain on our side, and we will continue to defend the life-saving and compassionate care provided to Maya Kowalski by the physicians, nurses, and staff at Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital, and the responsibility of all mandatory reporters in Florida to speak up if they suspect child abuse. This is the quote that I thought was very poignant, was, make the wrong call and a family might be broken up needlessly. Ignore a warning sign and a child might end up dead. That is really the catch-22 that they find themselves in when they're dealing with stories like this and situations like this. Like, what do we do? And I think a lot of times they think, well, what's the worst case scenario? We make the decision to put the child in protective care, we figure out what's going on, and then we give the child back. That's what they think. That's what I think. No one's technically going to jail, so they're thinking the worst case scenario is that we have emotional abuse by an investigation of child abuse or sexual abuse or whatever it is, but at least we've done what we think is right. And I believe that's what the hospital felt they were doing. I really do look at the actions of this doctor who did the report as her failing to do her obligation of not including the report of the prior doctor, which ended up being the whole entire reason why they really felt that the mother had made this stuff up. So they go to the final hearing but another hearing with the judge. And at the end of this hearing, this was really heartbreaking to me, is that at that point in time, it had been 80-something days that Beata has not been able to touch her daughter that she gave birth to, held every time she cried, made sure she was okay, and is in fear that she is dying. Because when she talks to her other doctor, Dr. Kirkpatrick, he believes that if she doesn't get the treatment she needs from the ketamine, that she will slowly die a painful death.
He was under the impression that she would get a blood clot.
That she would get a blood clot, and then it would start to release. Painfully. Yeah. So now this mother's sitting, I have goosebumps again. The mother's sitting there, and that's what she's been told. She's absolutely, and when CPS takes control of your child, you now have no rights to something that is yours. So they're telling you when you can call, how long you can talk, what you can say, and so she felt powerless, completely powerless. So at this hearing, where they're now they're ending the hearing by saying again, we're not changing our ruling. We're keeping her into the care of the hospital until further notice. So at the very end of the hearing, Beata asks for if she can hug her daughter. I know, it's so sad. So she says, can I hug my daughter?
The simplicity.
Yeah, a simple hug. A simple hug to hug her daughter. And the judge says no. He says no. And I like I say before, it's a hard place to be in. Being a judge in these situations, it really is hard. And I can go through a whole story of the psychological behind why he may have said no for the hug. Is that right now they're thinking that there may be Munchausen syndrome, which means in order to kind of reverse that, you kind of need to get the child away from the mother. So that hug could potentially be detrimental. I mean, there could be a million reasons why, but one of her attorneys says that it was, I think she said, is that no one can get that hug back. Mm-hmm. None of us can get that hug back. And she believes that if she had been able to give the hug, then the tragic event that happened days later wouldn't have happened. And what unfortunately happened is that Beata Kowalski, Maya Kowalski's mother, at 43 years old, after 87 days of no contact with her daughter, no physical contact with her daughter, and the fear of her dying, she committed suicide. She hung herself in her garage. So that is how that part of the story ends, with her daughter sitting in the hospital, a father who now has to tell his daughter, who has been begging to see her mother, that she is no longer there. The son ends up being there when the body is found. It is just beyond traumatizing. And what the mother says is, and we had some of the stuff of what she ends up saying, but she ends up pretty much saying that the mother wrote a goodbye email. And in part, she says, she starts by saying, please take care of Maya and tell her how much I love her every day. She says, I'm sorry, but I no longer can take the pain being away from Maya and being treated like a criminal. I cannot watch my daughter suffer in pain and keep getting worse. And she says, please tell Kyle also that I love him very much and I hope that he grows up to be a strong, good man. And then she takes her own life. That's how much she couldn't take the pain of watching what potentially was going to happen to her daughter. And the other thing is that you don't know what's going to happen. That's what people, I think, were confused on how could she do that. And I'm like, that's because, especially if you don't know this criminal system or the legal system, or if you sort of do, or if you're from this country or not, let me tell you what. Where she's at is scary. At this point in time, they have accused her of these things and taking the child under a shelter hearing, which is civil, but there also was a pending criminal charge attached to that. So that means that if they felt like had enough evidence to do that, the very next thing they could have done based on their allegations was arrest her criminally, and she could have found herself sitting in a jail cell.
I think Beata knew she wasn't ever going to see Maya again. I think she knew there was no way out, and I really think she took the altruistic way in knowing this kind of would end this family, like this falling apart family. She knew like she had to be the bigger person and answer all of what they needed. Yeah. And I think they're absolutely on point on that, because one of the things that she had even offered to, I think, the Child Protective Services is she had said, listen, I am willing to move out of the family home. I am willing to move out to stay away from her if you could just let her come home. She was in so much fear that being at the hospital that she was at, where they weren't recognizing the symptoms and they weren't recognizing the disorder, they weren't going to give her the treatment, that she was going to die. And so they really just wanted her to be able to come home so then they could go somewhere else to get the treatment that they needed, while the hospital was in fear of that exact thing happening. But she had offered that exact offer, was like, I'm willing to leave my family. And even Jack, the husband, he said the same thing during interviews. He said,
whatever needs to be done, I'm willing to do, even if it means keeping my own wife away from my child, even though I don't believe that should be what's happened. But if that's what you're requiring and you're forcing me to do that, I will do anything in order to get my child back. And they denied all of those type of remedies. But and we're going to talk more about the trial probably at the next episode, because there's no way we're going to be able to squeeze it into this one, because I really do kind of want to delve into the Child Protective Services and where they were at and how difficult it is, because I don't want people to look at like, oh, well, all Child Protective Services are they're biased and they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And like we said, is that it's a really, really hard position to be in a lot of the times. And once you get investigated, they hold you to a higher standard than almost any parent at all. Like when I was young, if I talked back, I was probably gonna get slapped up, shoe on the face. Like there was all kind between all the people in my family, I was constantly getting spanked up, slapped up, all kinds of different stuff. And that was how it was when I was growing up. It was completely normal. If anyone in my family had opened up at a protective services investigation and really looked into it with the high standards that happens once you're in that system, you're lucky if you're ever going to see your children again. I mean, it really is a high standard. They start interviewing your kids and they're like, well, has anybody yelled at you? I would have been like, yeah, let me tell you the whole list. Like, oh, I got 20 people to tell you yelled at me today and said all these things to me, you know? Because it's a really hard position for Child Protective Services to be in and a judge to be in. But that's why I think it really stems from them having to be, they have got to stay to their obligation to not being biased. And that's what really took place here, is that if that doctor had really looked, I believe more and really taken into account the report from the prior doctor, it could have changed us being here, because that means that since Child Protective Services had outsourced it to this doctor, Sally Smith, through Suncoast, that means the hospital is they're trusting that. So the hospital's going, the doctors are going, if that's what they're saying, we are all going behind that. Like we're all trusting that's the right diagnosis. That meaning diagnosis means they were diagnosing technically at that point in time the mother that she has this Munchausen syndrome, and then they ended up kind of shifting their thoughts to maybe that it wasn't Munchausen syndrome, that really maybe Maya was making up the allegations, to where I guess they said they did a whole investigation where they were videotaping her all the time, surveillance, because they wanted to see if she was going to accidentally move her foot or something like that. And I just think of you would hope at the same time they were treating her not like that, because if you thought those things about her mom and now you're thinking she's making it up, how are you treating her when her mommy's not there and her daddy's not there, you know? So one of the things that also became, painfully clear once they did the investigation was that the caretaker, which was also just disappointing, was the caretaker actually who was sitting there taking care of Maya, and she had actually she'd been charged with child abuse herself, had actually been charged with child abuse in her role as a social worker. And so what we find out is that there is an instance where they wanted to take pictures of Maya's body in order to kind of document where she was at. And in my opinion, I think this happened in January, and they had taken her into custody in October. So now in January, you trying to get photos of her seems insane to me, but I guess they tried to get photos of her and she didn't feel comfortable doing it, and so they held her down. Maya Kowalski, they held her down, they took her shirt off, they took pictures of her in a bra and little boy shorts, and Maya will say that she is so insanely traumatized by that entire thing.
Oh my God.
So imagining now that instead of what's happening is that after this mother commits suicide, it starts getting a lot more local press on it, and it should never come to that.
No, and I think that's what Beata saw. She was like, I think she realized the severity of the situation they were in, and she knew she had to do something severe in order for her to save her daughter. Yep. And it's unfortunate that honestly her plan worked. What she manifested is what happened.
Oh. And you have to understand this doesn't follow the normal mold. And once again, they're thinking that it follows a normal mold because they're saying that oh, we were right. That's why this mother has committed suicide. And really, as we know now, they were severely wrong. So we're running out of time today. And so join us next week as we will really delve into what took place during the civil trial that resulted in $251 million has been awarded to the Kowalski family. You can never, ever, there's not enough money that can ever bring back this mother, which is really the sad part about it, is that there is no real justice in it. And I think the only real thing that we can hope that we can take from something like that is that everybody can learn to do better, to be better, to investigate fully without having a bias. Because when I've dealt with these systems before, I have literally said to myself years ago, I remember thinking when I was representing a mother who was feeling suicidal, and I remember telling to her, you have got to hold on. I remember thinking, this could be the result. You could literally cause parents to commit suicide. So thank you so much for joining us for Legal.
Ladies and